And Mr. Greenwald does sincerely send his apologies for not being here in person. These things happen. You know, the original idea of this tour was to have a liberal perspective on civil liberties, which you just heard from Mr. Greenwald, a libertarian perspective on civil liberties, which you'll be hearing momentarily from Mr. Jacob Holmberger, and a conservative perspective. Well, yes, I have worked for Ron Paul, and I currently work in some capacity for Senator Rand Paul, so I'm often confused for a libertarian, and I certainly don't mind the label, but I've always called myself a conservative. I supported Pat Buchanan in '96 and 2000 for many of the same reasons I supported Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012. I just really don't like the neoconservatives is really what it's all about. Now, what does that mean? I think examining any discussion of where we stand in this country when it comes to civil liberties, so the assaults and the situation that Glenn just explained, first requires understanding how we got here, what's happened in the last decade. We do have this massive national security state. Everything from the TSA, which we've had to deal with, 10 times this week already? To things like warrantless wiretapping and the Patriot Act. How did we get to this point so rapidly in the last decade? Well, of course 9/11 happened. Everybody knows that sort of changed the game. It was the worst terrorist attack on American soil, and rightfully so. We expected government to do something, to react. These people had to pay for one of the most murderous acts in American history, for sure. The question is, how did we react? Well, a lot of people, me included, supported going into Afghanistan after 9/11. There was a clear link, it seemed, between the Taliban and the people who carried out the 9/11 attacks. It seemed like a rational thing to do, it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. Not only did the Bush administration have popular support amongst the American people for this, but across the globe, other countries, this made sense. 9/11, you have to go take care of this. Sort of a consensus globally that this was a righteous and moral and just military action. Well, we did that. Nobody knew we were going to be there over a decade, but we did that at the time, and we're still there, unfortunately. What else did we do? How did we react to 9/11? Well, some in the Bush administration had their eyes set on Iraq for a while. And I'm talking about people like not only Dick Cheney, vice president, who almost acted as a president during those 4 years, but people like David Frum and Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, those people who were called neoconservatives. They had had their eyes on Iraq for a while, and in my opinion, and it's not my opinion alone, they used 9/11 as an excuse to start a war with a country that did not attack us, had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, and that's exactly what we did. Well, we all know how long that war lasted, and we also know that if Al-Qaeda was a problem before 9/11, because of things we were doing around the world. You know, the complaint of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda co-conspirators was that we had troops on the Arabian Peninsula after the Persian Gulf War, that we were on their holy land. That was their primary complaint. If that was a problem before 9/11, we expanded that problem tenfold with our permanent occupation of Afghanistan, of which we're still there, and going to Iraq, of which we kind of gotten out of, but there are still troops there, but we stayed there certainly longer than anyone expected, including most Americans and the rest of the world. Now, the reason that's worth bringing up in any discussion as it relates to civil liberties is so many people, and I'm talking about at Capitol Hill, Washington leaders, the political establishment, have not learned their lesson. We had a speech from presidential candidate on the Republican side, Mitt Romney, just 2 weeks ago at the Virginia Military Institute, where he sort of chided Barack Obama for not having a foreign policy that was more like George W. Bush's. Now, that's funny to a person like me, because I don't really find many differences between what President Obama's done and what George W. Bush did. George W. Bush enhanced executive power and went to war just whenever he felt like. Obama not only did that, but didn't even bother to consult Congress. At least George W. Bush did that with Iraq. You have situations like the Patriot Act, which was, that was anathema to the left at the time. Boy, this is horrible, the Patriot Act, and Obama has one-up Bush with the National Defense Authorization Act, which is even worse than the Patriot Act, and I'll get to that in a second. But this idea that Romney gave in his speech at the Virginia Military Institute, that it was our job to make the world safe for democracy, that America can spread freedom, that the job of our military is not just for our national defense. What most normal, rational Americans think of when they think of the U.S. military is that it is defending our country and our interests. No, Mitt Romney gave the speech that we have to, teach everybody what freedom's all about, spread democracy globally at the point of a gun, and that's what we're for, humanitarian missions, showing people how democracy is supposed to happen. Woodrow Wilson in his time called this making the world safe for democracy. It's what they described as Wilsonianism, or Wilsonian progressivism, however you want to say it. Now, the reason I bring that up is that so many of my fellow conservatives considered Romney's speech sort of the core of what a conservative foreign policy should be. Well, it's absolutely not. And you don't have to take my word for it. I direct you to an interview that George Will conducted with William F. Buckley just a few years before his death in 2005. Now, George Will at this point had soured on the Iraq War and thought Afghanistan we'd been there way too long. He wanted Bill Buckley's opinion on it. For those who don't know, Bill Buckley was the founder of National Review, the premier conservative journal in the United States. Now, George Will asked Bill Buckley in 2005, quote, "Today we have a very different kind of foreign policy. It's called Wilsonian. And the premise of the Bush doctrine is that America must spread democracy because our national security depends on it. And because America can spread democracy, it knows how. It can engage in nation building. This is conservative or not." William F. Buckley replied to George Will, "It's not at all conservative. It's anything but conservative." The idea that you can use government intervention, particularly in a military form, to transform cultures, not only that might not be culturally prepared for democracy, but might not really want democracy, they might want theocracy or other forms of government, is a utopian way of looking at things. That is what Romney's speech represented. Most of what you've heard from Barack Obama in his foreign policy speeches aren't much different. That we are a beacon and a torch of freedom. When past Americans have said that, they meant that as an example. People want to come to this country. What makes us exceptional is our free markets, our work ethic, and the fact that anybody can come here and make something of themselves, and it has nothing to do with class. It has to do with the sweat of your brow and hard work, and that's what it means to be an American. It does not mean exporting that across the world and trying to make Afghanistan into Vermont. That is a utopian premise. It is impossible. Now, I always tell my fellow conservatives who disagree with me on foreign policy, it is a conservative dictum that government intervention affects human behavior. Tax regulations, raising tax rates, any kind of business regulations. I've had hour-long conversations on talk radio, people going crazy about the Department of Motor Vehicles line being too long. Just people, get really fed up with government very easily. But for some reason, so many of my fellow conservatives can't understand that the most violent or oppressive type of government intervention, the decision to wage war or to stay in a country for a decade on end, is going to cause a human reaction. If before 9/11 it was enough to anger people to want to murder 3,000 innocent people, well, what's it going to do with a decade being in Afghanistan or being in Iraq as long as we have? Now, that is not, as Rudy Giuliani put to Ron Paul in a 2008 debate, blaming America. When a police officer investigates a crime and they look for a motive, are they excusing the crime? No, they're trying to understand why the crime happened so they can get to the bottom of it, prevent it, and catch the culprits. Well, this is no different. We are foolish if we say, well, they just hate our freedoms. They hate the fact that we have tight blue jeans and pornography and liquor stores on the corner. It's a little bit more complex than that. Now, the reason I bring up our foreign policy at all, this is about the war on terrorism and civil liberties, you can't understand the state of civil liberties and the assaults they're under without understanding that foreign policy background. We've gotten to the point, Benjamin Franklin said that when you trade liberty for security, you get neither. We've gotten to the point where it's a general consensus amongst Republican and Democrats, I don't care if it's George W. Bush, Barack Obama, or Mitt Romney, that we need this vast national security state, but we never bother to ask the big questions. I ask you here today, how does having thousands of troops stationed in Afghanistan for a decade on end prevent one lone individual in New York or some other state, for example, from trying to blow up his underwear on an airplane? How does that even work? How does having a foreign policy of we should probably aid rebels in Libya who end up being members of al-Qaeda, or aiding rebels in Syria who end up being people who kill our diplomats and attack Americans, how does that stop some crazy person from trying to blow up their shoes in a mall somewhere in Wisconsin? It doesn't make any sense. We have a Cold War mentality for what is a completely different kind of enemy. Our foreign policy never asks those big questions, and that is nowhere better illustrated than how we conduct our what we consider trying to keep us safe. What we were going to talk about today, our assault on civil liberties. The Patriot Act was designed after 9/11. People wanted something to happen to keep tabs on the bad guys. There are people out there, obviously, we had this awful tragedy, who want to do bad stuff for us, so we have to give the government power to spy on us, give the executive branch power to put away enemy combatants without trial, indefinite detention, if you will. We have to erect this Department of Homeland Security, including the TSA, who are going to treat Americans at the airport anytime you want to travel like criminals. Every time I go through there, I think the terrorists have won. Osama bin Laden in hell, wherever he's at, has to be proud of himself when he sees the TSA. We have sort of, it's not only against the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment what we've done to our civil liberties, but it's anti-American. We are supposed to be for liberty and freedom and the Constitution and the liberty that Benjamin Franklin said we should never relinquish in the name of some security that could never be had. But there's a scene in the movie The Departed. I'm a big movie buff. I guess this was about 2006. That sort of was instructive to me, the partisanship of sort of the civil liberties issue. There's a scene where Martin Sheen is playing a cop. Do y'all remember The Departed, the gangster movie? Jack Nicholson, Leonardo DiCaprio, Matt Damon? There's a scene where Martin Sheen is playing a cop. It's a sting operation. Jack Nicholson is the gangster. He's up to no good. And Martin Sheen says to his fellow officers, well, thanks to our federal friends over there, all the cell phones during the sting operation are under surveillance. And Alec Baldwin just gets his big smile on his face. He's a police officer as well, and walks up to his fellow cop. He puts him in a headlock and he says, Patriot Act, Patriot Act. Now, this was a criminal sting operation. These weren't Muslim terrorists. That's an indication of, and Glenn Greenwald has mentioned this in his columns and in his speeches this week, the Patriot Act has been used far more for just general criminal investigation than anything that has to do with terrorism. And that's true for basically any legislation that's been passed post 9/11. It's used to spy on us. Now, I have some examples of that. There was a report released just last month by the ACLU. If you thought George W. Bush, if you're on the left, George W. Bush and Cheney started all this, Obama, it's not his fault. Well, it's a little bit worse than that. Justice Department documents released by the ACLU revealed that federal law enforcement agencies are increasingly monitoring Americans' electronic communications and doing so without warrants, sufficient oversight, or meaningful accountability. That sounds pretty scary. How does that break down in the numbers? The ACLU reported that between 2009 and 2011, the number of people subjected to telephone wiretapping had doubled or tripled depending on the category. That's just from 2009 to 2011. George W. Bush is gone. This is under the Barack Obama administration, the guy who said he's going to stick to American values and get rid of the Patriot Act. The government also conducted more telephone surveillance in those 2 years than it had in the previous decade. As far as snooping through your email, the ACLU reported that the number of authorizations the Justice Department received to use certain devices to conduct internet surveillance increased, get this, 361% from 2009 to 2011. Earlier this year, the New York Times reported that cell phone carriers received 1.3 million demands for subscriber information in 2011 alone. That's from our federal government. An ACLU public records project revealed that police departments around the country, large and small, engage in cell phone location tracking. Now, I just mentioned a scene in a movie that was speculative. It's not speculation. This is real. This is happening. The ACLU, who most people think of on the left, you would think would want to defend this president and not release these numbers from a pure partisan perspective. Well, they're there, and Obama has out-Bushed Bush when it comes to assaults against the Constitution and these civil liberties. Now, I don't say that with pleasure. I'm a conservative who never liked George W. Bush, which is why I work for Ron Paul. But I think it's worth noting the consensus that's there. That's what's scary. A lot of people get worked up about conspiracies. Something nefarious is happening behind closed doors, something that shouldn't be happening, and if we find out about it, we could catch these criminals, throw them in jail, and everything would be okay. That does happen. But what is far more frightening is a consensus when both Republicans and Democrats agree that getting rid of the Fourth Amendment, ignoring the First Amendment, and spying on our private conversations, I don't care if it's a Facebook chat, an email, Your private telephone conversations, carte blanche. They can do all of that now, thanks to the Patriot Act and the NDAA. The NDAA itself, and for those who aren't familiar, is the National Defense Authorization Act, is worse than the Patriot Act in the sense that people used to get upset about the Patriot Act, and rightfully so. One aspect of it, Bush could take what are called enemy combatants and hold them without trial. This is your Guantanamo Bay, without due process. People have died in Guantanamo Bay without being charged with anything or even knowing what their crime was. Well, the NDAA allows, and Obama promoted this explicitly, American citizens to be arrested without due process and detained indefinitely. That's you or I. That can happen on American soil. That is not constitutional. I don't mean to laugh, but it's just so laughable that our politicians would even think of going there. Well, one such politician is my own senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham. I'm not a big fan. I'll say that right off the bat. But, when I worked in talk radio in Charleston, South Carolina, if you couldn't tell where I was from, I know my accent sounds very like I'm much from Colorado. I used to ask Senator Graham, in my role as a conservative talk host, Senator Graham, why are we fighting in Iraq for so long? In Afghanistan, he'd say, well, Jack, we got to fight them over there. We're going to have to fight them over here. I heard that a million times, not just from him, but boy, did he like to say it. Well, the NDAA, which Lindsey Graham heartily promoted, now designates the entire American homeland, our own soil, as the battlefield. So those provisions in the Patriot Act and NDAA, if they think you're up to something, you're part of Al-Qaeda, or you might have shook a terrorist's hand one day, throw you in jail, no trial. The president decides. A Republican president can do that, a Democratic president can do that. If Romney wins, he has that power, thanks to the NDAA. Graham also added, when people like Senator Rand Paul and some other conservatives and liberals protested this, he wanted it explicitly known that if you were picked up under such suspicion, this is a quote from Lindsey Graham, you could say, quote, when they say, I want my lawyer, you tell them, shut up, you don't get a lawyer. Congressman Justin Amash of Michigan, who I think is a great constitutional conservative, called the NDAA, quote, one of the most anti-liberty pieces of legislation of our lifetime. He's absolutely right. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the assaults on our Constitution and our historic American individual liberties. Our next guest is going to represent the libertarian perspective on these ideas. He is Mr. Jacob Hornberger. He is the founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He received a BA degree in economics from the Virginia Military Institute and his law degree from the University of Texas. He was a civil and criminal trial attorney in Texas for 12 years and also served as an adjunct professor of law of economics at the University of Dallas. He used to be a regular libertarian commentator on Judge Andrew Napolitano's Rest in Peace Freedom Watch. Boy, do I miss that show. And I have to say the Future Foundation has been one of the leading organizations in fighting for the cause of liberty for a very, very long time. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jacob Hornberger.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you, and we've had just an awesome tour. This is actually part two of our College Civil Liberties tour. We did this last winter on the East Coast, and it was just so fantastic. We just had such a wonderful time. We said, let's take this thing out west. And we've been to Seattle, University of Washington, and the University of California at Davis. Then we went down to San Diego, over to Tucson last night, and we're wrapping things up here at Boulder. And I want to thank the Young Americans for Liberty for co-sponsoring this. It's just been great for us, where we just come in and everything's organized, and I know how much work goes into putting these things together, and we're really, really grateful. It's just such a great organization. You guys are just doing great work all across the country, and it's a real pleasure and honor to co-sponsor this with you. After 9/11, the military, the president, and the CIA decided that they were going to establish this special military camp, an incarceration center, a prison camp, and what ultimately turned out to be a judicial system in the country of Cuba. And it was ironic that it was in Cuba because, of course, the Cuban communist system is sort of special in the way they handle incarcerations and prosecutions. And when they announced that they were going to do this, I was very intrigued about this, given my law background. And I thought, well, this is going to be a fascinating experiment on how the government operates totally independently of any constraints, because they announced early on that the Constitution would not apply at Guantanamo Bay, that they would be subject to no constraints whatsoever. And I thought, well, this is going to be an interesting thing. You know, I mean, they're going to create this brand new kind of system for prosecuting terrorists, which has always been a criminal offense. I mean, you can go into any federal court in the land today, and federal judges and federal prosecutors will tell you that terrorism is a criminal offense. They prosecute them every day. And here was the military setting up a competitive system. Now, I had no doubts as to what the attributes of this system were going to be, but I thought, well, this is going to be interesting because this is sort of a model for the world, you see. What kind of system are they going to produce that's going to be competing against our federal court system that our ancestors established with the Constitution? Well, one of the reasons I had no doubts as to what they were going to do with this thing was that I was familiar with what happened on 9/11. 9/11, 1973, in the country of Chile. And that was their 9/11. Prior to the military coup that brought Augusto Pinochet into power as a dictator of that country, the country had been democratically run by a socialist communist named Salvador Allende. And Allende had been duly elected, fairly elected in a democratic election. He was what we might call a liberal today. And the CIA and the Nixon administration were outraged over this. You see, those of you that are in college today, you've grown up in your teenage years with all this thing of, oh, the terrorists are coming and the terrorists are going to take over our land and they're going to conquer us and they're going to take over, the public school system. They're going to run the schools and so forth. And so there's been this aura of fear. Well, we went through the same thing when we were teenagers, except that the big bugaboo then was communists. You see, the communists were going to come to get us, and man, Fidel Castro was going to send his army over into Miami, and it was going to go up the East Coast, and Nicaragua was going to turn communist, and man, we were having to look under our bed for communists, and, everything was communist. I mean, even to the point, and I'm sure you know this, that they sent 58,000 of my generation to their deaths in a war in Southeast Asia that was absolutely an idiotic thing to die for. And if you think they won't do that to you, you better think again. Because if they do a misstep and they get this country involved in a major war, there's a reason why you guys are out there registering for that draft. And that's so that you will be readily available to be called up and possibly spill your guts, part of your head, your brains hanging out, or some idiotic battlefield in Asia against China, or what have you. Because they will have no reservations to do that. They had no reservations about doing it to my generation, including some of my schoolmates at Virginia Military Institute. Well, what happened was that the CIA, on Nixon's orders, went into Chile and said, let's get rid of this guy, even though this is democracy. Let's make the economy scream, is the way Nixon said it. And so he sends the CIA in there and did everything they could to create an economic crisis. Now, what's interesting about this is that they used an economic crisis to exercise these omnipotent military dictatorial powers, the same kind of powers that were assumed after our 9/11 that came in response to a terrorist crisis. So the economy goes into crisis in Chile. The Pinochet regime, he was a military general, he takes over in a coup, ousts the democratically elected regime, and establishes a system in which the military has the power to start rounding people up. Liberals, communists, socialists, people who had served in the Allende regime. Rounded up some 50,000 people and proceeds to torture, rape, and execute about 3,000 of them. including 2 young Americans. A guy that was around 24 or so, another guy about 30. And, of course, the CIA and the military here denied any role in this. They said, oh, no, we're shocked that this is happening. Until about 25 years later, there was a great movie that was made about this called Missing, about these 2 young Americans, starring Jack Lemmon and Sissy Spacek. If you've never seen this movie, it's absolutely awesome. I mean, it'll send shudders up your spine as to what happens when the military takes power like this. And it turns out that a State Department document is released that says, turns out 25 years later that the CIA participated in the execution of at least one of these Americans, Charles Horman, the younger guy, and possibly both. No investigation, no grand jury indictments over here, nothing. And just a couple of days ago, just this week, the news media is reporting that the Chilean Supreme Court has authorized an extradition order on a U.S. military official who was stationed in Chile at the U.S. Embassy or one of the consulate offices there, asking for his extradition for participating in the murder of these 2 Americans. And so the military was rounding people up, utilizing these powers with the full support of the U.S. military and the CIA. I knew that when they were setting up this camp at Guantanamo Bay. I also knew what they had done in 1953 when they had ousted the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, who had been Time Magazine's Man of the Year, who had been a revered, respected man in Iran, democratically elected, and they ousted him, the CIA did, in a coup, because he was nationalizing British oil interests. And the Brits asked the CIA to go in there and oust him, which they did. And they installed a brutal dictator called the Shah of Iran, who proceeded to utilize emergency powers for some 25 years, rounding people up, taking them into military dungeons and intelligence dungeons, torturing them, killing them. Until 1979 rolls around and there's a giant Iranian revolution in which they take American diplomats hostage. It's the subject of this new movie, Argo, that maybe you've heard about. And of course, what U.S. officials said, is that they just hate us for our freedom and values. These people are crazy. They're just taking our diplomats hostage. And very few Americans knew what the Iranians knew of how this government, the U.S. government, had destroyed their experiment with democracy, and something the Iranian people to this day have never forgiven or forgotten. I knew that. I also knew more recently that the U.S. government had partnered with the Egyptian military dictatorship under Hosni Mubarak. You know, when you see these Iranian people protesting against Mubarak, they weren't just protesting against Mubarak. They weren't just demanding his ouster. They were demanding the surrender of an emergency power of the military there that stretched back 30 years, a temporary power, a power to round people up, take them into intelligence dungeons, military dungeons, torture them, and even execute them. And it had been a power widely exercised against dissidents, against critics of the Egyptian regime. And that's why these protesters were saying, no more in this country. We're tired of it. The U.S. government had funded this military dictatorship for some 30 years. By the way, these emergency powers had been instituted 30 years ago when the president of the country had been assassinated. Imagine, temporary, lasting 30 years. Surely, not as long as the temporary powers exercised by the U.S. government since 9/11, 11 years of temporary powers. But this is what these people were angry about, the protesters, and they're still angry about it because to this day, the military dictatorship will not relinquish those powers. A dictatorship that receives $1.3 billion from the U.S. government in taxpayer money. I had no pretensions as to what kind of system the Pentagon was going to establish at Guantanamo Bay. And that's exactly what they did. They established a system that was modeled after Pinochet's Chile, the Shah of Iran's Iran, Mubarak's military dictatorship, the dictatorship in Bahrain, which the U.S. government partners with. It was a regime where the military could take anybody anywhere in the world into custody and hold them forever, torture them, and even execute them without, perhaps with some kind of kangaroo military tribunal. Now, there was another reason I knew they were going to do this. And that reason stretches back to around 1791, 1787. You see, we all are born with this federal government in our midst, right? I mean, you know, all of a sudden you start becoming aware of things in life. You reach 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old. And one thing that you become aware of is the existence of the federal government of the United States. But how many of us ever sit there and say, how did this thing come into existence? Where did it come from? Well, it might surprise you to know that when the Constitution was proposing to call the federal government into existence in 1787, a lot of Americans opposed it. They said, well, no, we want no part of this. We don't want you to call this federal government into existence. We oppose the Constitution. And why? Because they said, if you do this, you are going to inevitably saddle either us or our successors with a government with powers that are going to be omnipotent in nature, powers in which the military, a vast military force, can take people into custody, incarcerate them in military dungeons, torture them, and even execute them. We've had that experience under the British government, where the British kings would do that exact same thing. Take British citizens into custody, cart them away to the Tower of London and torture them and kill them. Or even worse, I mean, you recall the movie Braveheart, where the British soldiers and lords had the prerogative of taking a bride on her wedding night in Scotland and taking her away and raping her on her wedding night before she could make love with her husband. And so our ancestors said, we want nothing to do with this because this is what's going to end up happening. And the proponents of the Constitution said, you don't need to worry about this. Because you see, for the first time in history, it's not going to be a government telling people what they can and cannot do. It's going to be we, the people, that are going to be telling the government what it can and cannot do. And that's for the purpose of this Constitution. It's not only going to call the government into existence, it's going to tell the government what it can and cannot do. And so there was a list of enumerated powers. And the idea was, okay, if a power is there, listed, enumerated, they can exercise it. But if it's not, they can't. So people said, okay, that makes sense. But we still don't trust you. And we want to demand that if we go along with this deal, there will be enacting a Bill of Rights, just to make clear of what this government cannot do. And it really shouldn't have been called a Bill of Rights, because it's not a Bill of Rights at all. You see, aren't we all ingrained in our public schools and all this that the Constitution gives us our rights? That, oh, well, do we have a right? Well, let's go look in the Constitution and see if the right's there. It's nonsense. It should have been called a Bill of Prohibitions because it doesn't give rights. You will search in vain in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights for any grant of rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, right to keep and bear arms. They don't give you any of those rights. Examine the language very carefully. It prohibits the government from interfering with pre-existing rights, rights that pre-exist government, God-given rights, natural rights, rights that exist even if there was no federal government. But among these rights, these guarantees, are four that stick out in a different way because they're not natural God-given rights. There's the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment. And they're different when you look at them. They arise in the context of what happens if the government wants to do these things to people. It wants to round them up. It wants to cart them away to a dungeon. It wants to torture them. It wants to execute them. This is what people were concerned about in 1787 and later 1791 when the Bill of Rights was enacted. They said, not in this country, that this government will never have that power. You want to search a person's home? You want to try to keep people safe from some mass murder or child molester? No, you're not going to just start going and searching people's homes for that violator because we value our privacy more highly than we do safety. You will get a warrant from a judge before you do that, and you've got to have probable cause that the person who is being targeted for that search has committed a crime. And you will not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, ever, without due process of law. And that phrase, due process of law, is an unbelievable phrase in our heritage of liberty. It's phenomenal. You know how far back this phrase, due process of law, stretches? All the way back to the year 1215. That was the year that the great barons of England held their own king, their own government at the point of a sword, and said, we demand that you acknowledge that your powers over we the people are limited. That enough of this coming and just picking us up and taking our lands and taking our families and cart them away to the Tower of London and torturing them. Enough of that. Never again. Acknowledge to us that you will never ever do this again in violation of the law of the land. And that phrase, law of the land, slowly evolved over the centuries into the phrase due process of law that became incorporated into the Fifth Amendment and later into the 14th Amendment. Now, look at what kind of society we have post 9/11. We live in a society in which the military has the omnipotent power to take any one of you into custody right now. All they have to do is label you a terrorist and cart you away and be tortured and executed, possibly after some kangaroo tribunal. That is an incredible power. It is the most revolutionary transformation in American law in our lifetime, certainly, possibly the history of this country. It is absolutely incredible. And when they did it at Guantanamo, people were saying, it's a foreigners only. No big deal, Muslims, terrorists. What do I need to worry about? And we kept saying, listen to what they're saying. They've converted this crime, terrorism, into what they call an act of war, enabling them under their thinking to circumvent those four amendments. They said, we're at war now. See, we're at war. We don't have to follow this, but it's going to be our option where we can, if we catch a guy committing terrorism, we can send him into the federal court system, which they continue doing. They just did it recently when they extradited a guy from Great Britain just a couple of weeks ago. Or we can send him into our newfangled system over here, where, by the way, they created a system that totally violates all the principles in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, including habeas corpus. Their original idea at Guantanamo was not even to allow habeas corpus, to allow no attorneys, criminal defense attorneys, a presumption of guilt instead of the presumption of innocence that exists in our federal court system. due process of law, cruel and unusual punishments. Imagine, here they are creating their model system. But you see, it didn't surprise me because this is what our ancestors said was going to happen if you didn't have all these guarantees. And for some 100 and some odd years, 200 something years, it worked until 9/11. We live in a country in which the government rounded up an American, put him in a military dungeon, tortured him, and claimed that they could keep him there for the rest of his life without a trial. And we kept saying, in the case of Jose Padilla, that if Americans let that happen, that Americans would be fighting for the prerogative of the government, the military, the CIA, to do this to all Americans. Because when they apply the case, the holding to one American, they knew what we knew as lawyers, that it applied to all Americans. And sure enough, they prevailed in the federal courts. And ironically, that as soon as they prevailed in the Court of Appeals, Federal Court of Appeals, with their argument that Padilla was an enemy combatant, that the military had the right to keep him forever, they immediately transferred him back into federal court jurisdiction, secured a grand jury indictment, carted him away, indicted him, and convicted him. What we said should have happened the whole time. But what they accomplished was the precedent that now hangs over the American people. And what Obama has accomplished is expanding this concept, this mindset, with the power to assassinate any American that the military and the executive branch deems a terrorist. They've already assassinated one American. They assassinated another American, his 16-year-old son. No judicial review, no accountability, no investigation. They don't even have to explain why they killed that kid. And they've seen no reason to do it. No one forces them to do it. That's the kind of country we now live in. Now, when John Quincy Adams gave a 4th of July presentation to the Congress, I think it was in 1824, he said, you know, fortunately, America is a country in which we don't have a vast military establishment, a standing army, because Americans opposed a big standing army when they founded this country. And they said, we're not a country that's going to go abroad in what he calls in search of monsters to destroy. Yeah, there's a lot of dictatorships around the world. There's people suffering under these dictatorships. There's conflicts, there's wars, there's famine, starvation. But this is not going to be a government that's going to go abroad to help you out. We're not going to do any humanitarian missions. We're not going to democracy spread with invasions, coups, regime change occupations, all these occupations, torture, kidnappings, and so forth. We're not going to come to help you. We don't even have the military to help you do that. Instead, what we're going to do is create a model society of freedom here in the United States for the world to emulate. That will be our contribution to the world. But, oh, by the way, if you are suffering under a tyranny, under a dictatorship, and you're able to escape, there is at least one country, always know there is at least one country you can go to without fear of being repatriated back to your country. And that was the United States, because there were no immigration controls either throughout the 1800s. Minor check for tuberculosis. But otherwise, you escape out of your country, this is one place. This is your sanctuary. That's how we help you. And he said that if America ever changes direction, and we end up with this vast military establishment, and we end up with a military that's going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, he says it's going to corrupt our values, our principles. It will turn America into what he called the dictatress of the world. And so here we have it. We have a vast military empire, 1,000 military bases all over the world, and they tell us this keeps us safe. That if it wasn't for all this vast military empire in 130 countries, bases all over, invasions, occupation, sanctions, embargoes, why we wouldn't even be having this assembly. And thank goodness for the troops overseas, because thank God I'm an American, because at least I know I'm free. And I see it at sports events. I was going to the Washington Nationals games, and we stand up and, everybody says, thank goodness for the troops, because we wouldn't be having this baseball game if it weren't for them over there. And you know what? It's all a lie. It's all a lie. I mean, I grew up believing this lie. I mean, when I was your age, and I really believed this was all freedom, because this is inculcated in us from the first grade, that you live in a free country. That's what makes you different as Americans, that you live in a free country, right? Who doubts that? We're different. We're free, and the troops are defending our freedom, which means we're free. And I believed all this until one day the scales just fell for me. I was in my 20s. And I was just stunned when I realized this isn't reality. How can you be free when you have this vast military establishment with these kind of powers? And that's what our ancestors understood. That you cannot have a free society with a government of omnipotent powers over the citizens. It's impossible. So what do we do about it? I mean, are we just saddled with this thing? I mean, we just give up and say, hey, this is it, this is our plight in life? No, I mean, that's the purpose of assemblies like this. I mean, this is why we brought together, unfortunately, Glenn is not here in person, and neither is Bruce. By the way, Bruce didn't have a minor illness that caused him to drop out. He had emergency surgery in San Diego with a hernia, a life-threatening thing, but he's fine, and he's now back in D.C., but these tours are grueling, But that's why we brought this tour together, to bring what's going on, to your awareness. And we bring a liberal, a conservative, another conservative, and a libertarian to show you that it doesn't matter what your ideological perspective is. You can be a liberal, you can be a libertarian, conservative, non-ideological. You may be still trying to work things out for yourself. Great. But this is the burning issue of our time. This is the most important issue ever in my lifetime, in your lifetime. It trumps everything else. Because let me tell you something. Right now, the sword is in the sheath, where they have the power to do this to Americans. But given the right emergency, the right circumstances, that sword can be taken out. And you can easily see a repeat of what goes on in Egypt under Mubarak, or under Pinochet, where the roundups begin. And by that time, it's too late to start protesting, because they will round you up too. Now is the time to become aware and to start transmitting ideas on liberty. And that's what changes the world. There's a reason why totalitarian dictators shut down meetings like this. Because they know the power that exists in meetings like this. We share ideas with you, and your life may never be the same. Now, you may walk away from this room saying, okay, this is a nice presentation. Yeah, okay. Or you may say, this really is important. This is critically important. And you start delving into it. And I'm going to send you a list of resources. If you give us your email address, I'm going to send you a list of resources. And you get involved in this thing and help us to really change the world. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to change the world. And we need help. We need people with passion, with ideas, ideals, principles. And that's you. That's where you come in. We want to have our American spring, where the whole world stops dead in their tracks and they see the American people rumbling, saying, this is not what America's all about. We're not a dictatress of the world. We're not a vast military establishment. We're not about torture and assassinations and executions and indefinite detention. That is not our heritage. And then we commit ourselves to restoring what this heritage is, while the rest of the world sits at us and marvels, in which we lead the world to the highest reaches of freedom that mankind has ever seen. And that only can come about through principles, ideals, commitment, and passion. And that's where we need you. Thank you very much.
And Jacob mentioned sending you some resource material. You'll see yellow cards that should be in and around your seats. If you will fill those out and hand them to the people on the way out, we will make sure not only you get that information from Jacob, but we are raffling off some books and other goodies. Now we come to the most important part of the evening, or a lot of people's favorite part, is where you get to talk back to us, the Q&A. I think the easiest way to do this is I'll select you when you raise your hand. Ask the question. Try to keep it more of a question than a statement. Sometimes people tend to want to give speeches, and we want to get as many questions in as we can. I'll repeat the question for purposes of recording, and we'll have a lot of fun. So let's get this ball rolling. This gentleman right here is standing up. During my presentation? Okay, fantastic. Okay. I'll repeat the question. You're fed up with the assaults on civil liberties is what you're saying. No. I don't think you're alone in that. Well, not necessarily. Throughout this whole tour, a lot of people. Okay, What is the rallying plan? What do we do is basically. Exactly. Well, let me address that question, and Jacob can as well. What do we do? Now, that's always the million-dollar question. Jacob sort of alluded to it. And look, a lot of people are angry, and that's the reason we're discussing these issues. That's the reason we're doing this tour. It's an education. It's highlighting. A lot of people don't know. You know, we know about these things. You say we're preaching to the choir. That's not necessarily true all the times. A lot of people are not aware that the President of the United States could pick you or I and say, we designate you a terrorist, throw you in jail, throw away the key, and there's no due process. A lot of people don't know that. You're going to have a lot of people who go to the polls here in 3 weeks who are going to vote for one of these guys and think that just everything's hunky-dory. Why? Because they don't even talk about it. Did anybody hear Mitt Romney or Barack Obama in any of the 2 debates even mention civil liberties or the Fourth Amendment or even the Constitution? They don't. Ignorance is bliss. You have to raise an awareness. To the degree that people start to understand these things, and they start to understand the situation we're in, they will become angry. To the degree, unfortunately, that bad things begin to happen. I'll give you an example. Government always gets out of control. When Social Security was enacted, the big controversy was a lot of people said, well, one day this might be used as identification. And the proponents of Social Security said, well, there's no way that could ever happen. Well, we have our Constitution, and when people, are we going to be able to throw people in jail, definite detention, what? Oh, that'll never happen. We have a Constitution. It's happening right now. And people are going to have to learn about these things and sort of get an education, and that's when they'll get angry, and that's when they'll vote that way at the ballot box, and that's when people will run for office who want to do things about that. And it's not just about that. It's a combination of education and activism and getting things done. Specific plans, I can think of a dozen congressmen and senators off the top of my head that I'll support to the end of the earth. People like Senator Rand Paul or his father Ron Paul or Congressman Justin Amash who are taking this fight to where it needs to be taken in Capitol Hill and raising these issues. I mean, in the House with Ron Paul running for president this year, Justin Amash has become the leading voice against stuff like the NDAA. I was at a Washington well, it wasn't the Washington party. I was in Tampa for the Republican convention. And I was at a party where Ann Coulter was and Justin Amash was. And he introduced himself to her, and she said, "Who are you? I've never heard of you." Well, people need to hear about him. That needs to be on talk radio. That needs to be what we're talking about. So we can talk about things like indefinite detention. Did you want to answer this as well, Jacob?
First of all, I'm grateful. I thought you were seeing red and coming after us. Well, what's he getting ready to throw? Hey, I'm just as indignant as you are. And when I realized that I'd been lied to throughout my years in public schools and stuff, I mean, I was just I was indignant. I'm indignant right now when I see what they're doing to the Iranian people. See, I don't get just indignant of what's happening in this country. I'm indignant over what they're doing to the Iranian people, the suffering they're inflicted. When they inflicted suffering on the Iraqi people, they were killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi people with their sanctions. When Madeleine Albright said to 60 Minutes, she was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, the official spokesman for our government to the world. 60 Minutes says, well, 500,000 Iraqi children have died because of the sanctions. Is this worth it? And of course, this was when they were trying to oust Saddam Hussein, who they had previously supported. And she said, well, yeah, it's a tough issue, but yeah, it's worth it. I mean, it was like horror. I mean, how can any person feel that way? And you can see their glee right now in the Iranian saying, yeah, right, maybe they'll oust their dictatorial regime. Yeah, after a lot of bloodshed. Look what they've been doing to the Cuban people for 50, 60 years with this cruel embargo. So, yeah. But let me tell you something, that it's, to go out with anger and unrestrained actions is the worst possible thing. You got to outsmart these things. Freedom, a free society is not easy to attain. If it were easy, everybody in history would have had it. Because you have governments attracting a body of people that love power. There's just something in their DNA. They love to exercise power. We see this in the drug war. Despite the fact that the drug war is a manifest failure, they don't want to let it go because they're just into the power of it. What we have to do is outsmart them. Figure out, how do you restore a free society, not with violence, because you never know where that's going to lead to. How do you do it through power of ideas? How did they bring down that Berlin Wall without any violence at all? How do we restore our freedom here through the mind, through intellectual activity, moral activity? And I get this question a lot. What can we do? Well, you have to figure that out. This is what we're doing. This is what we've figured out. We do a lot of stuff at the Future of Freedom Foundation in addition to this. But each person's got to figure it out. Jack's involved heavily in political activity. That may be your thing. Or you may say, well, I'm not interested in politics. Okay, what are you good at? And then all of a sudden, everybody starts participating in this movement, each in his own way, different groups. And something happens, a catalyst, to bring all this to the surface that none of us can even anticipate. And the world marvels and says, where the heck did this movement come from? Well, it comes from all of us that are as angry and as indignant as you and I, and figuring out ways to bring about the transformation entirely peacefully.
I just add, there are flashpoints. Remember what happened with CISPA and the sort of the internet? They were trying to clamp down on the internet. Was SOPA, HIPAA, CISPA. The online community got up in arms about that and shut down a lot of that stuff. So it can be done. That's an example of people seeing something. We don't want this to happen. That's just one example. Let's go to the next person. I believe we have a microphone now. Yes, sir. Sometimes it takes a second. Say it again. Okay, I can repeat the question. Go ahead.
At what point does the rate of the growth of tyranny necessitate an extra democratic solution, namely monetary, withholding your funds and reallocating your funds by...
Stuffing your money under the mattress like in the Great Depression era?
No, I'm not. But I am buying silver and gold. I'm talking more severe measures like stopping paying taxes.
Okay.
Things that are technically against the law, but that nonetheless would deprive the tyranny holders of funds they need to continue to wage their war.
Okay, Jacob, I'm going to let you take that first. It's civil disobedience. Well, he's the libertarian expert. I'm the political guy. That's up his alley.
Well, and we get this question a lot at the Future of Freedom Foundation because there is a big tax resistance movement where people refuse to pay their income taxes and so forth. And we have always never encouraged such a thing. Now, civil disobedience, we've always said, has got to be based on each person's conscience. Is it, what point would they cross the line where I would say, okay, I'm going to engage in civil disobedience? And it's a fascinating question, and I'm not sure I even know the answer myself, for myself. But tax evasion, tax evasion is an extremely dangerous process. I mean, if people went down that route, large groups of people, they inevitably would go after the leaders. They would indict them, they would convict them, they would send them away, and they have. Tax resistors are sitting in jail. My position is it's very, very dangerous to confront the state in its bailiwick. Let's say on the highway, a state trooper pulls you over and says, "Open up your trunk," and you don't have to. It's not constitutional. I mean, you can take a stand. I mean, I have when I was in my early 20s. That happened to me. The guy says, I was practicing law on the border where I grew up, and he says, "Open up your trunk." And I said, "You don't have that authority." And it was a roving Border Patrol checkpoint. And he says, "Don't you know the problem with drugs and illegal aliens and stuff?" And I said, "Well, you gave it away right there, man." I said, you can't be looking for drugs. And he says, "Well, you either go with me to the station or you open the trunk up." Well, I had friends meet me at the beach and everything, and I said, "Open up the stupid trunk," Well, that's their bailiwick, and you can confront them, and sometimes it's effective. But what I'm saying is, let's outsmart them, because there's our bailiwick. Like here, they can't confront, they can't do what we're doing with these assemblies and stuff. You get an average DEA cop or a Army guy, he can't participate in forums like this. And this is where the real actioners are in politics, getting people elected, writing op-eds for newspapers, sending letters to the editor, forwarding articles on the internet. That's our bailiwick. I mean, the internet, wow. That's where we're the experts. And so I say, fight them where we're good in our comparative advantage. If you want to go the civil disobedience route, fine, but be prepared to pay the penalty, because it's a harsh penalty.
Okay, let's try to get as many questions in as we can. Who do we want to? Let's see. Okay, we'll get you guys.
Said something interesting about the Libyan rebels being on Al-Qaeda.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's illegal to support terrorist organizations, haven't they violated their own law?
Absolutely.
How do we hold them accountable for that?
It's interesting. I wrote, the question was, if we're aiding Libyan rebels, and we know that some of them are Al-Qaeda, by actually some of the UK commanders said that. That was a story in The Guardian. Are we not violating our own principles or even the law by supporting them? Well, I wrote a piece when Senator John McCain was calling for aiding the Libyan rebels, called "John McCain Supports Al-Qaeda." Now, the title got a lot of attention, but I didn't do it just to be hyperbolic or to create controversy. I did it to make a point that was absolutely true. George W. Bush, when we went into Iraq, said, "You're either with us or against us." There was no gray area. You're either on the side of the terrorists or you're on the side of the United States. Well, if you're giving aid to a country like Libya to overthrow their dictator, which we'd given aid to prior, and we'll leave that aside for a second, and our own people, our own allies, and British intelligence or even our own CIA are saying, some of these people are Al-Qaeda that we're aiding and giving military weapons and giving financial aid, and you have a U.S. Senator named John McCain and Joe Lieberman and Lindsey Graham and others saying this is a good idea, they are aiding Al-Qaeda. What happened to that great area I heard about when George W. Bush was speaking? As far as the legal ramifications of that, I don't know how you pursue that, but it's certainly worth pointing out. Americans don't think about it in those terms. The Bush era, sort of that legacy, was all black and white. Bad guys, good guys, you get the bad guys, problem solved. Well, Muammar Gaddafi was a bad guy, and we gave money and weapons to people who turned out to be pretty bad themselves. It's not that simple. It's a very childish view of the world. Unfortunately, Obama's adopted it just as much with wanting to aid Syria and whatnot. And that's not that there's not horrible things happening there. Is it our role? Is it an asset for us to get involved, or is it a liability? It should always be, the determination should be, is it in our national interest, not the world's. We can't be the world's policeman, we can't change the world, but we can protect our country and our interests. If we're going to ask our best and bravest, the people who put their lives on the line, our soldiers, to make that ultimate sacrifice, it is their job to do their duty. That's all they can do. It is our duty as patriotic citizens to make damn sure when our government puts them in harm's way, it's for a good reason. So,
yeah, I might add that I think it's a great point, and also add that whenever the U.S. government is assisting one group to kill another group, whether it's a just cause or not, the group that they're targeting is going to get angry. I mean, it's just a fact of life because both groups think they're in the right. And so all of a sudden you've got this multiplicity of families and relatives that now all of a sudden are filled with rage against the United States. And let's not forget that when it was the Soviet Union occupying Afghanistan, the administration was helping the people that later became Al-Qaeda, the Osama bin Ladens and so forth. And they even asked, I forget who it was, the U.S. I think it was Kissinger maybe, that they said, well, you know, you're here helping these people, and he says, oh, what's the problem with helping a few radical Islamists when we're here? We've got the Soviet Union entrapped in its own Vietnam. Well, and then look what's happened. And the other thing about Libya is that what a lot of Americans don't know is that this is really a humorous part of this thing, is the CIA rushed in there in all the chaos of this thing, and they were looking for Gaddafi's files. And the reason they were looking for those files is because and Human Rights Watch beat them to it. The reason they were doing it, as Human Rights Watch has recently disclosed, is that the CIA was working with Gaddafi to torture people. I mean, here's the guy they said we need to oust, but before they joined the bandwagon, they were using him to torture people on their behalf. Even worse, they were sending Gaddafi anti-Gaddafi opponents so that he could torture the people that were trying to oust him. And then when the bandwagon started, they, of course, we're here as democracy spread. This is the corruption that these people are doing to us, to our country. This is why we have this perpetual threat of terrorism, which they then use to take away our freedoms. Because I called it the greatest terrorist-producing machine in history. And we didn't talk about it tonight, about foreign policy. But the more they invade and occupy and sanction embargo, the more they make people angry, the more the threat of terrorist retaliation, the more they take away our freedom.
Let's get to one of these gentlemen over here. Just real quick, 2 years before John McCain was advocating giving money to Libya, it came out that he was advocating giving money and weapons to Gaddafi, which we've been doing all along, but he thought there should be more. Shows you how insane it is. But yes, sir.
Thank you so much for coming here tonight. It's really wonderful to see a group of people proud guy on the spectrum together around.
That's the idea.
Too bad it has to be such an awful thing. So, you know, I'm curious, especially you, sir, as someone who identifies as conservative.
Don't blame me.
I've been ideological in the past, and I lived in Laramie for a while, and I hated that big Sheridan change my dad in Wyoming. And all my liberal friends were like, yeah, let's go get them. And then switch over to 2009. I'm like, the new guy, kind of like the old guy. And they just shut down, And all of a sudden now I'm this awful conservative where I hate Obama or something like that. And I'm like, hey man, I accept principles, I like the Constitution, whatever. But this barrier is very difficult.
Yes.
To get past. And I was wondering, where do you go in engaging your friends on the other side of the spectrum? You're sitting around having a beer, and you're like, there's some bullshit going on. I'm sorry to swear. But there's a lot of bad stuff going on, and I think we need to pay attention to it, and it's incredibly serious. Serious, and it is shut down. I mean, we talk about this principle,
That's a very good question. You're basically asking how you break down these barriers along partisan lines, what I call cultural identity along political lines. A friend of mine, when we did go into Libya, when Obama went into Libya, a very good friend of mine back home in South Carolina who's very liberal, thinks I'm crazy, said basically, Jack, let me explain to you why this is different from anything Bush would have done. I said, I'll let you explain this to me if you answer one question. If Bush was doing this, would you think it was a good idea? And he just looked at me. He's like, you got me. At least he was honest. But it really is we were talking about this with Glenn traveling the other day, because Glenn comes from the left, and he was sort of singing the praises of Ron Paul to many of his liberal friends, progressive friends for a long time. And they're like, oh, he's this right-wing, pro-life Republican who's for states' rights, and this is terrible. And he was like, he has a better position on civil liberties than most of the staff at Mother Jones in the nation. And it was absolutely true. And he was just saying that those sort of cultural obstacles are very hard to surmount, and he's right. To try to surmount them, which is your question, I try to start with where the other person is. and work backward to my position in all things. I never think it's a good idea, and Jacob sort of mentioned this, to go out there angrily and sort of get in people's faces and yelling about anything. I don't care if it's politics, religion, your favorite TV show, about anything. It's just not very effective. But you take something that's important to them, for example, and Ron Paul has done this himself in Iowa, or he did this election cycle. I'm pro-life. If I'm trying to discuss with fellow conservatives who disagree with me on foreign policy, that's a big cultural thing. Oh, Jackson, he must be a secret liberal and in league with Al-Qaeda because he doesn't want to fight him over there. And I say, you know, why are you pro-life? And they say, well, every life is precious. I say, I agree with you 100%. So if we kill 12 children in Iraq or Yemen or Syria with a drone strike to get one terrorist, you're okay with that? They say, well, that's just war. I go, sometimes teenagers get pregnant. Happens. So that's okay? And they're like, no, that's sanctity of life. And you sort of say these sorts of things, and you don't get in their face and be angry about it. But you can do that on the left and right. But just use specific examples. Start with where they are, what's important to them, and work backward to your position. I think that's the most effective way. That's just one example I use with my fellow conservatives. So generally, not with everybody. At least it opens their minds. That's the idea. This stuff doesn't happen overnight, but that's the idea. Let's take this lady way there in the back. Uh-oh. Sure. Ma'am, I'm going to have to stop you. Tort reform is a very important issue, but we're just trying to keep it to civil liberties and the war on terrorism and changing minds. We got a lot of questions and not a lot of time. Let's take this gentleman over here. Go. Sure, that's absolutely true across the board, but let's go ahead and take this question right here. Right. Go ahead, sir. I do. I'll let Jacob answer in his own way. Maybe he doesn't. I don't believe that, but I'm a political animal. Most of my friends these days in politics are libertarians because I work for Ron Paul and Rand Paul and have sort of been in that Ron Paul world for the last 5 years. And I often pick on them lovingly, you know, about dorm room conversations, about who's more an anarchist and who's more libertarian. That's great. That's wonderful. I like having those conversations, especially when I was 18 and 19 and whatnot. But what really animates me is the question you just asked. All right, we believe this stuff. How are we going to do something about it? I'm a firm believer that before political change can happen, you have to change the conversation. As a conservative who works within the Republican Party and works for very specific Republicans who I think represent something better and far and away different from Bush Cheney, I want the average Tea Party or the grassroots Republican to look at somebody like Rand Paul or Justin Amash or Mike Lee and say, that's a conservative Republican. I'm going to vote for guys like that. And this Dick Cheney guy kind of seems like a liberal. What's this FDR New Deal domestic policies they had and this sort of utopian foreign policy? That's happening right now. Senator Paul right now is sort of promoting this idea that we shouldn't be giving foreign aid to our enemies, people who will kill our diplomats and burn our flag. That overwhelmingly, the majority of American opinion is on his side. Now, what does that do? It does two things. First of all, we shouldn't be giving foreign aid to these people. Second of all, something that's been a general consensus in Washington, D.C. for a long time, that we should be giving foreign aid. Democrats think that, Republicans think that. It opens that window. You start having these conversations. I think Ron Paul's done more to change the political conversation in this country in the last 4 years than anybody in the last 50 years. And once you start to change the conversation, and other people who thought they could have never run, who believe these same things, start running for office this year, 2014, 2016, and beyond, and it's already happening, those people can get in the office and do what Rand Paul's doing, what Justin Amash is doing, getting up there, even if there's just a few of them, and really changing things in this country. It's not going to happen overnight. It might not happen in the next 10 years. But, you know, politics to me is like marriage. Even the person with the most perfect marriage in the world, what we think is a great marriage, will admit it's not completely perfect. It's an ideal. We have an idea of what a good marriage is. But people in a healthy relationship are always working towards that ideal. That's what you do when you love each other. I have a political ideal. It's called the Constitution of the United States. The closer we can get to that, we're winning. The further we regress, we're losing. I don't expect it to be perfect. I'll die, and it'll never become perfect. We'll make it a hell of a lot better than it is right now, and that's doable. So, Jacob?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'd like to answer it in the context of the methodology question. I think we've got a great opportunity coming up. They're out of Iraq, right? And they're saying they're going to get out of Afghanistan in 2014. Remarkably, the New York Times, just in the last 2 weeks, has said enough's enough in Afghanistan. Time to get out now. No point in one more soldier dying for nothing, killing people. I mean, it's just a total mess. Now, what happens when they get out of Afghanistan and there's no war going on? To me, people are going to start asking the same questions they did after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Why do we need this national security state that came into existence in 1947 to fight the former ally, the Soviet Union? There is no Soviet Union anymore. Now there's no more occupation of Afghanistan. The terrorism threat's going to plummet when the military's not over there killing people anymore. And they're already trying to stir up trouble with China. You can see they're changing their focus over there. We have a great opportunity in the next 2 or 3 years to cause people to reevaluate this whole concept of militarism and empire. So I see it as a great opportunity. But how do you achieve that? And that raises the methodology question, which is a fascinating question that this guy asked. I've come to the position that it's impossible to convert people. It's just impossible. I mean, I have brothers and sisters, and they're not libertarians. We, at dinner time, and when we get together and stuff, we just don't discuss this sort of stuff. If people that love you, you can't convert, then I've really come to the position in life that part of our job is to plant seeds. If those seeds germinate in people's minds, great. Don't worry about it. I don't worry about it. I sit here and I share these seeds with you, and fine. I walk away, and if it happens, it happens. If it falls on fertile ground. But even more important, I'm looking for people who have this philosophy. I'm looking. I'm not trying to change you. I have no interest in changing you. I'm looking for people that say, you know what? This makes a lot of sense. This is the way I have felt all my life. I want to know more. So you'll notice that in my talk, I don't try to convince you of anything. I simply set forth these principles with the hope that maybe there's 10 of you, maybe some more that say, by golly, that's what I am. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to do. And then as we find these numbers and we reach a critical mass, society shifts. All great movements in history have been led by an infinitesimally small minority of people. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, habeas corpus, all start out with small minorities of people. And you just keep growing and growing and growing until you reach a critical mass, which may be less than a majority. And all of a sudden society shifts. So yeah, you can't plan such a thing. There's no plan for it. But I have a lot of optimism that over the next 4 or 5 years, you may see the drug war go. I've never seen more people calling for an end to the war on drugs as I have now. And I think this concept of militarism and empire may be the next thing that people start questioning.
And talk about changing the conversation. I think for the first time, a poll showed that 51% of Americans thought marijuana should be legalized for the first time. And I think 10 years from now, it's going to be more so. In 20 years, yeah, absolutely. So we're getting close to time. Let's take 2 more questions. This gentleman over here.
Jacob mentioned economic disruption then the CIA's tactics spent there to what we see today, foreign and domestic. I was wondering if either of you believe that there is a similar analogy with respect to what we see today with the degradation of our president.
The intervention in Chile by our own CIA and their economic disruption, do we see a parallel there? With our own government.
Absolutely. We can see that the root cause of this, I mean, this was a great lesson of Greece and Italy, that the root cause of this economic chaos is out of control spending. and out-of-control debt. And they just keep piling it on. You're coming out of college owing, every citizen owes around $53,000. That's your share of this national debt. A family of four owes more than 200-something thousand. And now they're doing what they've done decade after decade. They're talking about cranking up the printing presses to pay off the debt with debased currency. Where you're talking about inflation, where you wipe out people's savings, older people's savings, people on fixed incomes. And in economic chaos is where you have the biggest opportunity for dictatorship. I mean, that's what happened in Chile. To a large extent, it happened under Roosevelt, under the Great Depression, which, by the way, as libertarians have shown, Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, have shown was caused by the Federal Reserve. And Roosevelt used the opportunity to nationalize gold, making it a felony offense to own what had been the official money of the United States for more than 100 and some odd years. And we see all over the world that economic chaos provides that emergency situation. Everybody gets fearful where they start exercising dictatorial powers. So you've got this integration where you've got out-of-control military spending, which is causing a deficit of they're spending $1 trillion more a year than what they're bringing in tax revenues. They're reaching their debt ceiling soon. They're looking at Greece, which is busted. They're bankrupt. That's the road they have us on. All these things are coming together. And yeah, it's important to prepare, to have some things to prepare in case those things happen. Some food stored away, some maybe gold and silver coins and so forth, as somebody suggested earlier. But ultimately, we have to hopefully change the system before it gets that bad, before it gets down to the Greece situation. But yeah, economic chaos, terrorism chaos, and the root cause of this, and this is, I can't impress, more important, the root cause of this is this system that has come into existence. Now, I'm a libertarian. This is where we would disagree with liberals. I think the economic chaos comes about through the welfare state, too. That's the other half of this equation. The Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, disastrous socialist experiments should never have been adopted. And that they're contributing to this economic chaos now, the farm subsidies, foreign aid to dictators, the whole shebang. So you've got the economic side, you've got the foreign policy side, and they are coming together. And things are getting pretty dicey, in my opinion.
Jacob sort of reminded me of, to answer your question again, these examples of how to get people by starting where they are. When people would say, conservative Republicans, well, Ron Paul's a liberal because he wants to legalize marijuana. I'd say, well, Milton Friedman and William F. Buckley wanted to legalize marijuana. Are they liberals too? And they'd be, I don't know about that. Again, it just opens people's minds. All right, final question, and actually this is going to be the final question of the tour. I don't want to put any pressure on you, but but this young lady's had her hand up the entire time, and don't mean to put any pressure on you, better be good though.
Majority of the general citizens do want to see action taken, but because their voices are being suppressed more and more due to the consumption of power by the executive branch, for instance, the loss of speech, association.
I think that's a liberal that divides left and right, global warming, but civil liberties, I think, is something that can unite left and right. Well, I mean, there we go. See, that's what I'm talking about. We had this example the other night. Somebody wanted to talk about abortion during the civil rights, and somebody was like, "Well, this is what I'm saying." So, here's the situation right now. Everybody, left, right, in the middle, independent, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, Green, you name it, Constitution Party, Reform, Libertarian, has many different ideas about many different things. Those cultural divides are deep, as this gentleman in the hat has experienced, and you sort of experienced here in about a 30-second interval of people sort of yelling at each other at a very low volume. Glenn Greenwald, coming from the left, writing for The Nation, doing stuff for Democracy Now!, we're talking about this, me writing at The American Conservative, appearing in The American Spectator, Jacob being a libertarian for decades and decades. We all come from different perspectives, but the point of this tour is that this overriding issue of civil liberties and what's happening in our Constitution is something that can unite on all fronts. It is a coalition worth building. You know, people pick on me. Well, Jack, Ron Paul agrees with Dennis Kucinich. Well, Dennis Kucinich is right on these issues. I always point out that John McCain agrees with Hillary Clinton on these issues. That's another way you can do it. That mushy middle is attacking the Constitution, and the far right and far left are protecting it. That was the purpose of this tour from the beginning. This is the last stop on this tour, and hopefully we sort of brought that coalition together a little bit. On behalf of the Future Freedom Foundation and Young Americans for Liberty, I really appreciate y'all being with us tonight. Thank you.